The sound came first, low and constant, a whine pitched just beneath hearing, the kind that lived in the back teeth before it ever reached the ear. It rose from the last steel run at the end of the corridor at the Coldwater County Canine Rehabilitation and Certification Center, and it had been rising on and off for 5 months. Why does an old farmer's truck idle in the same gravel spot outside the kennel fence every single Wednesday 4 years running before he ever sets foot inside? Nobody on staff had asked that question out loud. They had other things to ask. Somebody get the gentleman in the lobby a chair and a cup of coffee and tell him kindly this isn't a petting zoo, Dr. Marissa Kensington said, not looking up from her tablet, to no one in particular and everyone at once. 12 trainers, certified, credentialed, some of them flown in on the center's dime, had tried and failed with the dog in the last run. 5 months of silence. 6 days until the board's euthanasia review vote, moved up from 9 after a budget memo nobody wanted their name on. And in the chest pocket of a barn coat gone soft at the collar, worn by a man currently being handed a lobby chair like a bus station vagrant, hung a brass whistle on a braided leather cord that had not been blown, on purpose, by anyone in that building in 14 months. If you've ever been counted out before anyone bothered to ask what you knew, type "steady" in the comments. Behind the reinforced glass, the dog they called Bracken lay pressed into the corner of his run the way a man might press himself into a doorway during a storm. Flat, low, every rib visible under a black and tan coat gone dull. He had not eaten a full bowl in 3 weeks. He had not taken a leash in 5 months. He had a tattoo in his left ear, faded to a smudge, and 2 letters scratched faint into the underside of his collar that no one currently drawing a paycheck at Coldwater County had thought to ask about. The number ran 12 deep in Dr. Kensington's file. 12 trainers, 12 protocols, 12 failures logged in her own software with the calm, sourceless authority of a woman who said the data doesn't lie, the way other people said good morning. Outside, past the chain link and the gravel lot, an old Ford idled with its heater ticking, windows fogged at the edges, a seed company cap on the dash, and a thumb worn smooth resting against a whistle he had not yet decided to bring inside. He had done this on 30-some Wednesdays before this one, and driven home every time without opening the door. This Wednesday, for reasons the story would take its time giving him, he shut off the engine. Somewhere behind the desk, a phone was already ringing with the board member's assistant confirming Friday's early session. Somewhere in a drawer 3 years cold, a name that belonged on Bracken's intake sheet sat unwritten, because the paper that had once carried it had been fed through a shredder in a cost-cutting contract nobody remembered signing. And somewhere in the dog's shaking body was a sentence his silence was trying and failing to say. The old man in the barn coat got out of his truck, closed the door soft so it wouldn't bang, and started for the gate. Harlan Sowell was 76 years old, and he dressed like a man the world had already finished writing down. The barn coat had gone the color of creek mud somewhere around its 10th winter, and had stayed that color through 15 more. His cap, stamped once with a seed company's logo, now bleached to a rumor, sat low enough to shade eyes that missed very little and said even less. He moved without hurry and without waste, the walk of a man who had long ago stopped spending motion he didn't need, and when he lifted his left hand to push open the truck door, it trembled, faint and steady as a leaf in a draft that wasn't there. The tremor did not embarrass him. He simply waited it out, the way he waited out most things. He had done this every Wednesday for 4 years. He parked in the same rutted notch of gravel along the fence line, cut the engine, and sat with his hands loose on the wheel while the kennel building did its noise at a distance. The far-off bark chains, the clang of a gate, a truck backing a feed delivery toward the rear dock. He watched the building the way another man might watch weather coming, patient, unsurprised, already knowing more or less what it would do. Then, most Wednesdays, he started the engine again and drove home to a kitchen that had been too quiet for going on 4 years now, ever since Opal passed, and put a kettle on for one. This Wednesday, he reached instead into the coat's inside pocket and drew out a whistle on a braided leather cord, the brass gone the deep amber brown of something rubbed by thumbs for half a century. He did not blow it. He held it, thumb moving once over the worn place where the loop met the barrel, a groove worn smooth enough to catch a fingernail. It was a small ritual and an old one, the kind of thing a man does before a decision rather than instead of one. Then he put it back against his chest, buttoned the coat over it, and walked toward the gate. Levi Ogle saw him first. Levi was 24, 6 months into the job, still young enough that his uniform shirt looked borrowed from a bigger version of himself, and he had the particular alertness of a man trying hard to notice the things that would make him good at something. He was hosing down the intake bay when the old man came up the walk, and he stopped with the hose still running because something about the way Harlan crossed the gravel snagged at him. Not the coat, not the cap, though God knew those got looks enough. It was the economy of it. No wasted steps. No looking around for someone to ask permission of. A man who walked like he'd walked to 100 kennels before this one and knew exactly how far the gate was without checking. "Help you, sir?" Levi called out, and meant it, which was already more than the front desk was about to manage. Harlan stopped, considered the boy the way he might consider a fence post to see if it would hold weight, and said, "Came to see about the dog." Nothing more. He didn't explain which dog, though there was only one anyone in the county was currently losing sleep over, and Levi understood that the old man knew that, and knew that Levi knew it too. "Bracken," Levi said anyway, because saying the name felt like the polite thing, and because something in him wanted to see what the old man's face did when he heard it. Nothing showed. Or nearly nothing. A settling around the eyes, the kind of look a man gets reading a headstone he already knew the name on. Harlan nodded once and started walking again, and Levi found himself falling in half a step behind, hose forgotten, water running unattended into the drain. He noticed the hand next. Harlan's left hand hung loose at his side, and it trembled, a fine, persistent shiver that ran from the wrist down through the fingers. The kind of tremor Levi had seen in his grandfather's hands the last few years before the man passed. But when Harlan reached up to touch the collar of his coat, just briefly, just to settle it, the hand went still the instant it closed around the fabric near his chest, still as a stone, and then resumed its shiver the moment it let go. Levi filed that away without knowing why it mattered. He would understand later that he had just watched the man's whole biography pass beneath his eyes and had only caught the shadow of it. "You know him?" Levi asked. "Bracken, I mean. You work dogs?" "Once," Harlan said, and that was the whole answer, delivered so plainly that a lesser listener would have taken it for a man deflecting a question he didn't want to answer. Levi, 4 years too green to know better and sharp enough anyway, heard something else in it. Not modesty, not evasion, just arithmetic. Once, as in, once was the whole of it. Once was enough. Once had cost him something he wasn't going to spend words explaining to a boy with a running hose behind him. They reached the glass doors together. Levi saw the old man's hand rise again, briefly, to the place beneath his collarbone where the coat lay buttoned over whatever he kept there, and it steadied the way it had before, held for the length of a breath, and dropped. Whatever that was, Levi thought, it isn't nerves. Nerves don't work like clockwork. This was ritual, deliberate as grace before supper, and it happened at the same threshold every single time. The way a man crosses himself before he walks into a church he has grieved in more than once. He didn't know yet that the truck outside had idled in that same gravel notch every Wednesday for 4 years running before this one. That the old man behind him had made this walk, in his mind, more times than the boy had been alive, and turned back every time. He only knew that something about the stillness in that trembling hand didn't match anything he'd learned in his 6 months on the job, and that some part of him, quiet and young and not yet talked out of its own instincts, decided right there that this man was not lost, and not confused, and not somebody to be handed a chair and a cup of coffee like a stray. He was wrong about very little in his life so far. He would not be wrong about this. The front desk did not share the boy's instincts. "Sir, is somebody expecting you?" the receptionist asked, in the particular tone reserved for men who did not look like they had appointments, her eyes moving from the barn coat to the truck outside to the clipboard in front of her, as if the three of them together might resolve into an explanation. Harlan said he'd come about the dog. She asked which dog, though she already knew. Everyone in the building already knew, and when he said Bracken, she picked up a phone with the small, satisfied efficiency of someone passing a problem upstream. By the time he reached the observation room, he had been asked for identification twice, asked if he was a family member of an employee, asked, not unkindly, but not gently either, whether he understood this was a working facility and not open to the general public. He answered each question with as few words as the question required, and no more, and stood, when at last he was allowed to stand, at the back of a room with a wall of reinforced glass looking in on a run, where a dog lay pressed low into the corner, sides going in the shallow, rapid rhythm of an animal that had stopped believing in rest. Dr. Marissa Kensington ran the room the way she ran everything, with a tablet in one hand and a visiting board member at her elbow, a man named Colonel Everett Pruitt, whom she had not yet learned to be careful in front of. She was 38, precise in a way that read as confidence to people who had never seen the underside of it, and she had built her reputation and her patent, and this Friday's contract pitch, on 12 months of behavioral data she trusted the way other people trusted Scripture. The Kensington Protocol accounts for over 400 behavioral variables, she was saying to the colonel, tablet angled so he could see the graphs. Fear conditioning, resource guarding, handler transfer trauma. We've run this animal through all 12 certified pathways and gotten flatline responses across the board. The data doesn't lie, Colonel. This is, unfortunately, a dog whose profile falls outside anything rehabilitable. It was then that she noticed Harlan at the back of the room, cap in his trembling hand now, coat still buttoned to the throat, standing the way a man stands at a wake, quiet and unhurried and entirely unbothered by being looked past. "I'm sorry," she said, not sounding it. "Who let him back here?" "He says he came about the dog," the receptionist offered from the doorway, as if reading a verdict. Doctor Kensington studied him for exactly as long as it took to file him into a category she'd already built for men like him. Well-meaning, out of his depth, probably read something online about dog whispering. And then she said it, lightly, the way a woman says something she expects to be forgotten by lunch, with the colonel standing close enough to hear every word of it and laugh, once, softly, before catching himself. "Sir, I appreciate you coming down, I do, but this dog has been assessed by 12 nationally certified trainers and none of them could reach him. I don't mean any disrespect, but I don't think whatever you've got in your back pocket is going to succeed where 400 behavioral variables and $500,000 of program funding couldn't." Behind the glass, Bracken's whine rose a half step, thin and constant, and nobody in the room but Harlan seemed to hear it change. He did not answer her. He did not so much as shift his weight. The silence he offered back was not the silence of a man with nothing to say. It had shape to it, the particular density of a held breath, and it went on a beat longer than was comfortable, long enough that the colonel glanced at him with the first flicker of real attention anyone in that room had spared him yet. Then Harlan looked past her, through the glass, at the dog folded into the corner like something trying to disappear, and he said the only sentence he offered in that whole exchange. "He's not scared of me. He's scared of being asked again." Dr. Kensington opened her mouth to answer that and found, for a moment she would not examine too closely later, that she didn't have one ready. They let him sit outside the run, mostly, Levi would think later, to prove a point rather than out of any real hope, and they gave him a folding chair on the corridor side of the glass, close enough to see the dog's ribs and far enough that no one had to admit they were watching him do anything. Harlan set the chair a full body's length back from the mesh, angled slightly, not square to the dog, and sat down slow, coat still buttoned, cap in his lap. He did not speak to Bracken. He did not reach toward the gate or crouch or coax. He simply sat, forearms on his knees, and let his eyes do the only work he seemed inclined to do that afternoon. An hour passed that way. Levi drifted back twice on invented errands and stayed both times longer than the errands required. Dr. Kensington checked in once, tablet under her arm, said nothing, and left again, the silence of the corridor pressing at her back like a held door. The dog did not move from his corner, but Harlan's attention did, small and constant, tracking the things a room full of certified protocols had apparently not thought worth tracking. The set of the ears, which lay flat but not pinned, angled forward at certain sounds and not others. The way the weight sat back on the haunches rather than tucked fully under, a coiled posture, not a collapsed one. The eyes, which moved to the gate every time it so much as ticked in its hinges, then away again, deliberate, disciplined, the look of an animal choosing not to watch rather than one who had forgotten how. "He counts the gate," Harlan said at last, mostly to himself, mostly for Levi, who had come to lean in the doorway with the particular stillness of a young man trying not to spook a conversation he wasn't sure he'd been invited into. "Sir?" Every time it moves, he clocks it, then looks off, like he's not interested. That's not fear that's forgot how to notice things. That's a dog holding a discipline. Harlan's eyes didn't leave the run. Fear goes sloppy. This is neat. Somebody built this into him a long time before anybody in this building ever met him. Levi frowned, working it over. The protocol logged it as shutdown, total behavioral withdrawal. Doc says the data's measuring what's there, Harlan said, and it was the longest sentence he'd spoken since the gravel lot. It can't measure what he's remembering. Different thing. He tipped his chin toward the run, unhurried. You ever see a soldier stand at parade rest so long he forgets he's doing it? Looks like nothing to a stranger. It ain't nothing. It's the last order he was given, and he's still holding it, on account of nobody's ever come back to tell him different. The ears flicked, a fraction, at the sound of Harlan's voice pitched low and even, and settled again. It was such a small motion that Levi almost missed it, and might have, if he hadn't already learned in the space of one afternoon that the old man in the barn coat did not spend attention on things that weren't worth the cost. 12 trainers came at him 12 different ways, Harlan said. Diet changes, toys, voices soft, voices firm. Every one of them was trying to teach him something new. He turned his cap over once in his lap, an old habit, the brim worn pale along one crease from 30 summers of the same grip. Nobody's tried talking to him in the language he already knows. And you know it, Levi said. It wasn't quite a question. Harlan didn't answer that directly. His left hand had drifted, without seeming to notice it was doing so, up to the buttoned place at his chest, and it went still there. The tremor arrested mid-shiver, the way a held note goes quiet, and stayed still a long moment before falling back to his knee, shaking again, faint and constant. He watched the dog. The dog, very carefully, did not watch him back, and held its position at the corner of the run with the discipline of an animal executing an order 4 years and 5 months old, waiting, the way Harlan himself had waited in a truck at the fence line every Wednesday since Opal's kitchen went quiet, for someone to finally give the release. Word had gotten around the building by then, the way word does in a place with thin walls and long shifts. And by the time Harlan rose from the folding chair, there were more eyes in that corridor than the afternoon had started with. 2 kennel techs pretending to check a feed schedule, the receptionist with a stack of files she wasn't reading, Dr. Kensington back again, arms crossed, tablet dark against her side, and Colonel Everett Pruitt standing a little apart from her with the particular attentiveness of a man who had learned a long time ago to watch hands before he watched faces. Harlan didn't announce anything. He simply stood, unhurried, the way he'd done everything since he walked through that gate, and reached inside the barn coat with his left hand. The tremor was there the whole way up, faint and steady, until his fingers closed around the brass. Then it stopped. Not slowed, stopped, the way a compass needle stops once it's found north. And the hand that lifted the whistle to his mouth was as level and sure as a hand 30 years younger. He gave 2 notes, low, then rising, held a beat, released. For 5 months, that corridor had heard barking, whining, the scrape of nails on concrete, the low subsonic thread of a dog trying not to exist. It had not heard silence like the silence that followed those 2 notes. Even the ventilation seemed to quiet. Levi would swear later that his own heart stopped keeping normal time for the 3 seconds it took for anything to happen at all. And those 3 seconds stretched the way a held breath stretches, past comfortable, into something with weight to it. Bracken's head came up first. Then his ears, which had lain flat for 5 months, rose the way tent poles rise, full and forward. And his whole body seemed to remember, all at once, that it had a spine built for something other than folding into a corner. He came up off the floor in one motion, no hesitation in it, no confusion, the motion of a dog who has run this exact sequence 10,000 times before and simply hadn't been given the signal in longer than anyone in this building had worked here. He crossed the run in 4 strides, straight to the gate, and sat. He sat the way a report snaps to attention. Spine straight, haunches square, head level, eyes forward and up, fixed not on the gate latch, but on Harlan's hands, waiting for whatever came next, the way a man waits at the top of a stair he's climbed 1,000 times in the dark. Nobody in the corridor moved. That's one of the kennel techs started and didn't finish, because there wasn't a word ready for it. Doctor Kensington's arms had uncrossed without her seeming to notice. She was staring through the glass at a heel-positioned sit so textbook clean it looked staged, performed by an animal her own 400 variables had logged as unresponsive to every stimulus known to certified science. And for the first time since Harlan had walked through her front doors, she had absolutely nothing prepared to say about it. Colonel Pruitt had gone very still beside her, the stillness of a man doing arithmetic in his head and not liking the number he was arriving at. Harlan lowered the whistle. His hand, still closed around the brass, held steady 1 breath longer, then opened, and the tremor crept back into his fingers the moment the cord slipped loose against his coat. He looked at the dog through the mesh the way a man looks at a door he has spent 4 years deciding whether to knock on, and he said, quiet enough that only Levi, closest to him, fully caught it. "There you are." Bracken did not break the sit, did not whine, did not paw the gate, did not do any of the things 5 months of shutdown might have predicted. He simply held the position, eyes on Harlan's hands, waiting, the way a soldier waits for the order that comes after attention. And the whole corridor understood, without anyone saying it aloud, that whatever else this dog was, broken was no longer the word for it. The intake file came up on Dr. Kensington's tablet 9 minutes later, because somebody had to say something, and paperwork was the only language left in the room that still felt safe to speak. "Prior handler," she read aloud. Flat, professional, a woman narrating her way back onto solid ground. Listed as deceased. Unit unknown. Dog transferred to county custody 14 months ago via state surplus reassignment. She looked up. That's it. That's the whole handler history. Whoever trained him isn't in this system. "He's in the dog," Harlan said, and didn't elaborate, and didn't need to, because Bracken was still sitting at the gate, patient as stone, watching the old man's hands. The board's early session got confirmed that same afternoon, moved from 9 days out to 6. A line item in a budget memo nobody wanted their name on, folded in with 3 other cost decisions, and the phrase "behavioral euthanasia review" sat on Dr. Kensington's screen next to a photograph of a dog now standing calm at a gate he'd refused to leave the corner of for 5 months. "It's a fluke," she said, mostly to the colonel, mostly to herself. A conditioned response to an auditory cue, that's all that was. Dogs imprint on sound patterns all the time. It doesn't mean... She stopped, because Bracken had turned his head, at that exact moment, toward Harlan and not toward her, and held it there, waiting, the way you wait for someone you trust to finish a sentence for you. "My protocol will replicate it," she went on, quieter now, more to convince the room than to instruct it. "We'll log the frequency, run controlled trials. This is exactly the kind of anomaly the data is built to absorb." She said it like scripture. It came out sounding like a question. Harlan, meanwhile, had drawn the intake sheet toward himself with 2 fingers, unhurried, and was reading it the way a man reads a gravestone with a name spelled wrong on it. "Deceased, unit unknown." He read it twice, and something in his face went very quiet and very still. Stiller even than his hand had gone around the whistle, and when Levi glanced over, he saw the old man's thumb resting, light as a held breath, against the collar looped over the back of a folding chair, against two pencil-faint letters scratched into the leather that nobody else in that room had thought to ask about. D and O. Harlan did not say what he was thinking. He set the file down exactly where he'd found it, squared to the desk edge, and folded his trembling hands together in his lap, and waited. The way he had waited in a truck at that fence line every Wednesday for 4 years, for the rest of the room to catch up to what he already half knew. Colonel Everett Pruitt arrived at Coldwater County 2 days later, in civilian clothes that did nothing to soften a posture 40 years of service had built into permanent architecture. And he did not go to Dr. Kensington's office first. He went to the observation corridor, where Harlan sat again in the same folding chair, and he stood a long moment just inside the doorway before he spoke. The particular pause of a man confirming with his own eyes something he'd only half believed over the phone. "That whistle," Pruitt said. 2 notes, low then high, held on the second. "I haven't heard that cadence called live in over 30 years. "You've heard it somewhere," Harlan said. It wasn't a question either of them needed answered. "I signed papers for a man who taught it that way. Only a handful of instructors carried that exact call and release forward past 71. The course standardized a different tone after that, cleaner, easier to teach fast. Your version's older, rougher." Pruitt came further into the room, eyes on Bracken, who had risen at the sound of the colonel's boots, and then settled again once he judged the newcomer no threat. An appraisal made and finished in under 2 seconds. "Where'd you learn it, Mr. Soule?" "Same place everybody who still uses it learned it," Harlan said. "From somebody who couldn't stand to see it die with him." Dr. Kensington had followed the colonel down, tablet in hand out of habit rather than need, and she stood at the glass listening with the particular attention of a woman rebuilding a floor plan under her own feet in real time. Pruitt had brought a folder of his own, thin, official, retrieved from a records office 2 counties over that still kept certain paper the digitization contract hadn't reached in time. He laid it open on the corridor bench. Bracken's ear tattoo traces to a litter assigned out of a state K-9 program 11 years back, cross-referenced against training logs that never made it into the county's digital system because they were never digitized. Purged, actually, 3 years ago, in a cost-cutting contract that fed 40 file boxes of paper kennel records through a shredder to save on storage fees. He looked up. The vendor who ran that purge is the same vendor who supplies the data backbone for the Kensington Protocol now. The silence that followed had a different texture than the one that had followed the whistle. That one had been awe. This one was closer to dread, and it belonged, most heavily, to the woman holding the tablet. His first handler, Pruitt said, wasn't deceased. He was dropped from the roster. Training yard accident 3 years back, before the purge. An equipment rig failed and put him in the hospital for the better part of a year. Nothing that killed him, just enough to end his service and make him administratively inconvenient to keep tracking. Easier, apparently, to mark a man deceased unknown unit than to follow up on where a discharged corporal with a long recovery actually went. He said the name like he was setting something heavy down gently. Corporal Dale Ogle. Levi, who had come in halfway through, holding a leash he'd forgotten he was carrying, went very still. "That's my father's name," he said. Nobody answered him right away, because the room needed a moment to arrive at what he'd just arrived at faster than any of them. And Harlan, watching the boy's face do the work of rearranging 4 years of grief into something else entirely, said the only thing that fit. "He's alive, son. 2 counties over. Veterans home." He let that sit a moment before he added the rest, gently, like handing over something that might be too heavy to catch fast. "He trained this dog. Taught him that whistle before you were old enough to remember him doing it. Somebody just never wrote his name down right, and it's been easier for 4 years to leave it that way than to fix it." Dr. Kensington had gone very quiet at the glass, tablet held loose at her side, and when she finally spoke, her voice had none of the polish it usually carried. "I need to check something," she said, and it came out smaller than any sentence she'd delivered all week. She pulled up Bracken's file on her own system, scrolled back through months of logged assessments, and found it 8 minutes later, sitting exactly where her own software had put it 8 months earlier. A flag, automatically generated, reading incomplete input data. Recommend manual record review prior to certification pathway assignment. Beneath it, a second line, an override, time-stamped, carrying her own credentials. She looked at that override for a long moment. Nobody in the room asked her to explain it. She didn't offer to. "I overrode it," she said finally, "to no one and everyone." The way Harlan had once said something similar in that same corridor, except her voice had none of his stillness in it, only the flat, stunned honesty of a woman reading her own signature back to herself. The state contract review was 6 weeks out. A flagged, incomplete file would have meant pulling him from the certification pipeline for reassessment, and that would have meant admitting the protocol had a gap it couldn't close. She set the tablet down on the bench, screen still lit, the override glowing there like something she couldn't look away from. The data didn't lie. I just didn't let it finish talking. The veterans' home sat 2 counties over, low brick and green shutters, the kind of building that smelled of coffee and clean linens, and something underneath that no amount of either could quite cover. Levi rode there in the passenger seat of Harlan's truck, hands twisting in his lap the whole way, saying almost nothing, because there was nothing small enough to say. They found Dale Ogle in a chair by a window that looked out on a maple gone half gold with the turn of the season. A blanket over his knees he didn't seem to need, and he was humming, low and tuneless to anyone who didn't know it. 2 notes, low then rising, over and over, to no one, to the window, to a dog 4 years and 2 counties gone. Levi stood in the doorway a long moment before his father's eyes found him, and there was a silence in that room different from every silence that had come before it in this story, heavier and lighter at once. The kind that happens when a grief a young man has been carrying for years turns out, all at once, to have been standing at the wrong grave. Harlan did not go in right away. He waited in the hall, coat buttoned, cap in hand, and let the boy have that room to himself for as long as it needed. And it was some time later, after Levi had come back out with his eyes red and his jaw set in a way that looked older than 24, that Dale Ogle asked, in a voice worn thin by years and stroke and disuse, who the man in the barn coat was. "Name's Harlan Sowell," Harlan said, coming in slow, taking the chair across from him without being asked, the way 2 old soldiers sit down together without needing an introduction to know what the other one carries. "Corps trained me same lineage as you, different years, 68 to 71. I never met you, Corporal, but I know your whistle. Been hearing it in my sleep since before your boy was born. Near enough, on account of the man who taught it to me taught it to a whole line of us the same rough way. And I expect somebody taught it to you off that same line, 1 hand back or 2. Dale's hand, thin and spotted, found the arm of his chair and gripped it, the gesture of a man anchoring himself to something solid. "Anvil," he said, not a question, just a name surfacing. Harlan went still, the way his hand went still around the whistle, and something in his voice, when he answered, had a crack in it no listener in this story had heard from him yet. "My partner. 1968 to 74, he ran with me, 6 years after we came home together, before he went old and easy in his sleep. I wrote that call down on Opal's kitchen table the week I got back, so I wouldn't lose it, so it wouldn't just live in my head and die when I did. Been teaching it quiet to county handlers for near 40 years since. Never asked for a dime, never asked for a name in a file, just didn't want it to end with me." He looked at Dale a long moment, and at Levi standing behind him, and at the window and the half-gold maple beyond it, and he said, plain as anything he'd said in that whole corridor of doubters, the sentence that had been sitting in him since the moment Bracken came up off that kennel floor. "He's not broken, son. He's just been waiting for the right 2 notes." Dr. Kensington had come along at Levi's asking, quiet in the back seat the whole ride, and she stood now near the doorway with her tablet left, for once, in the truck. When she finally spoke, it wasn't the voice she used in front of boards or cameras. "I'm sorry," she said, to Dale, to Levi, to the room in general, and did not dress it up with anything else. "I had the flag. I had the truth sitting in my own system for 8 months, and I chose the contract over it. She let that sit, uncushioned. I don't want to replace what you know, Mr. Soul. I'd like to learn it, properly, however long that takes. Harlan considered her the way he'd considered the fence post 4 days before, testing for whether it would hold weight, and found, this time, that it would. Wednesdays, he said. I generally come around anyway. The board reversed the euthanasia order 6 days later, in a session that ran 11 minutes and produced, for the first time in the center's history, a unanimous vote with no memo attached. Bracken's record was corrected in the same sitting. Prior handler, Corporal Dale Ogle, U.S. Army K-9 Corps, honorably discharged following a service-related injury. Not deceased, never deceased. Simply misfiled by a shredder and a budget line 3 years back that nobody had thought worth double-checking. Colonel Pruitt read the correction aloud himself, and his voice caught, once, on the word honorably, and nobody in that room thought less of him for it. Levi began co-handling Bracken the following week, awkward and earnest and improving daily, and Dale came in Wednesdays now too, when his health allowed, sitting in the same folding chair Harlan had sat in, humming 2 notes to a dog who no longer needed to be found by them, only reminded, now and again, that someone still knew the tune. Weeks passed the way they do, quietly, without announcement. The gravel notch along the fence line went unused most Wednesdays now, because Harlan had less need to sit and watch from a distance. Though he still came by, still let the dog lean its whole weight against his knee while Levi worked the basics, still said little and watched everything. On an evening in early autumn, the light gone the particular gold that only shows up for about 20 minutes before true dark, Harlan sat on his porch step with a cup of coffee gone lukewarm in his trembling hand. The brass whistle hung back on its nail by the door where Opal's gardening apron still hung, faded, unmoved in 4 years. The two of them keeping each other company on that same nail the way old things do. Down the road, headlights swung wide around the bend and turned in toward the house, slow over the point.